The dust rose around them as the fighters charged once more, their boots hammering against the dirt, the compound echoing with the sound of impact. The mechanic staggered to her feet, her chest heaving, her vision blurred, blood streaking her arms. Her body screaming at her to stop, but her mind refused. She clenched her fists, her stance wide, her eyes blazing with the fury of someone who had been underestimated too long, and as the circle tightened, she whispered to herself, "Not today." The leader came first, his frame towering, his strikes sharp and merciless, his fists slicing through the air. She ducked the first blow, barely the wind from it rattling her skull. She countered with a desperate strike of her own, but he blocked it with brutal ease, his elbow snapping against her ribs. The pain tearing through her body. Her knees almost buckled, but she caught herself twisting low and driving her shoulder into his stomach, the shock forcing him back a step, but not enough to break his rhythm. Not enough to save her. The others seized the moment, their bodies moving in unison. Two fists caught her in the side, one kick slammed into her thigh. She stumbled, nearly falling, the compound spinning in her vision, but she gritted her teeth, her arms rising to deflect another strike, her legs sweeping out to take one fighter down. The man hit the dirt hard, gasping. But before she could breathe, another slammed her back against the wall, the air driven from her lungs, the impact rattling her bones. "Ay!" Crowd of recruits shouted from the edges, some with awe, some with disbelief. They had never seen anything like this. The mechanic, a woman who should have been broken long ago, still fighting, still standing even as the best fighters in the yard reigned. Down fury upon her, the instructors exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing, their expressions unreadable. But their silence spoke louder than any words. This trial was no longer about defeat. It was about revelation. Her breath came ragged, her arms heavy, her legs trembling, but deep inside her chest, something still burned hotter than the pain, hotter than the fear, the memory of every whispered doubt, every dismissive laugh, every moment she had been told to stay in her place. She thought of the engines she had rebuilt when no one believed she could. She thought of the nights alone when she trained in silence, copying the moves she had seen in secret. She thought of the chance to prove that she was more than a shadow in the hangar. Leader pressed in again, his strikes faster, more precise. He wanted to end this. He wanted to crush the defiance from her body. His fist slammed into her shoulder, nearly spinning her off her feet. His boot struck her leg, sending lightning pain through her nerves. She dropped to one knee, her vision swimming. The fighters moved in, sensing the end. But then she lifted her head, her eyes cutting through the dust and blood, and for a heartbeat even the leader hesitated. She rose like a machine refusing to die, her fists curling her breath, steadying her stance, tightening her body broken, but her will sharper than steel. The fighters surged again, but she moved with a ferocity none expected, her strikes no longer cautious but ruthless, each blow thrown. With the raw power of survival, her elbow cracked against a jaw, her knee slammed into a rib, her boot snapped into a shin, the air filled with groans as bodies hit the dirt around her. The leader roared, driving forward, his fists a blur. She dodged. One strike barely, the next grazed her face-splitting skin, blood running hot down her cheek, but she answered with a savage counter, her fist smashing into his throat, his body staggering back, his eyes wide for the first time. She pressed forward, unleashing a storm of blows, her body screaming with pain, but her spirit refusing to let go. The leader dropped to one knee, the dust rising around him, the compound silent with shock. She swayed, her chest heaving, her blood dripping into the dirt, her legs threatening to collapse, but she held herself upright, her eyes never leaving the leader. Her fists still raised, though her arms trembled. The fighters around him hesitated, uncertain, the recruits at the edges frozen, the instructors staring, the silence deep enough to drown the heartbeats of everyone in the yard. And in that silence, the mechanic realized she had one final choice. Either collapse and let this moment be stolen, or give every last ounce of herself to shatter the doubt forever. She drew in one last ragged breath, her fists tightening her muscles, screaming as she forced her body to move. One more time she lunged forward at the leader, her body a blur of willpower and pain, the fighters shouting as the compound erupted once more. The compound shook with the roar of voices as the mechanic hurled herself at the leader, her fists crashing forward, her body burning from exhaustion, her breath tearing through her chest, but her will unbroken. The leader blocked the first strike, his forearm snapping up with practiced precision, but she twisted low, her shoulders slamming into his stomach, her momentum carrying them both to the dirt. The recruits shouted, the fighters hesitated. The instructors leaned forward with sharp eyes. A leader rolled to his feet, his chest heaving, his eyes cold and furious, his body towering over her. But the mechanic rose as well, swaying, her legs trembling, her vision blurred, yet her stance firm. She raised her fists again, daring him to come. She had nothing left but the fire inside her still burned brighter than the pain, brighter than the doubt, brighter than the fear. The silence between heartbeats thick with the question of who would fall first. He came at her with speed and power, his fists slicing through the air. One blow catching her ribs, sending agony shooting through her body. She staggered, nearly falling, but she spun with the pain, using it to fuel her counter, her elbow crashing against his jaw, the sound sharp, the crowd gasping as the leader reeled for the first time, his head snapping back, his steps faltering. Her chest heaved with the realization that he was not invincible, that he could bleed, that he could fall. The fighters around them shouted warnings, their voices sharp with urgency, but the mechanic pressed forward, her fists flying. Her strikes wild, yet fueled with raw precision, each one landing harder than the last. The leader tried to counter, his arms rising, his body shifting, but the mechanic tore. Through his defense, her knuckles cracking against his face, her knee slamming into his chest, her boot driving him back across the dirt, until finally, with one last scream, she struck him down into the ground. Silence gripped the compound, the dust hanging heavy in the air. The leader sprawled on the dirt, his chest rising and falling. His eyes closed, his body unable to rise. The mechanic stood above him, swaying her arms, trembling, her face streaked with blood and sweat, her breath ragged, but she did not fall. Not yet. The fighters froze. Their pride shattered, their discipline broken. The recruits at the edges stared wide-eyed, their disbelief plain in their silence. The instructors finally stepped forward, their boots crunching against the dirt, their faces unreadable, their eyes sharp as knives. They looked from the fallen fighters to the mechanic still standing, her fists still raised, though her body trembled on the edge of collapse. The silence stretched until one of them spoke, his voice deep and steady enough. "You proved yourself." He said, his words cutting through the still air like a blade. "You fought beyond the limit, and you endured." Her knees buckled. She dropped to the dirt, her hands pressing into the ground to keep from collapsing, her vision, dimming, her lungs burning. But her heart steady. She had heard the words, she had earned the respect, she had carried herself through the storm. And when she lifted her head, her eyes blazing through the blood and dust, she saw something she had never seen before, the instructors watching her not with doubt, but with recognition. The recruits whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, some nodding in awe, all of them knowing they had witnessed something that would not be forgotten. The fighters who remained upright looked at her with a mix of resentment and reluctant respect, their pride bruised, but their eyes unable to deny what had been revealed. She was no longer just the mechanic, no longer just the one who fixed machines in the shadows. She had become something forged in fire and steel. The sun dipped lower across the compound, the shadows stretching long, the air cooling around the field. But the mechanic remained, kneeling, her chest rising and falling, her eyes fixed forward. She knew this was only one battle, only one proving ground. She knew more trials waited beyond these walls, more challenges, more enemies, more doubts. But she also knew that tonight something had changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who had seen her stand and fight. The instructors gave the signal, the fighters withdrew. The recruits dispersed, the compound emptying until only the mechanic remained sitting in the dirt, staring at the sky. Her body broken, her spirit. Alive, the silence around her, a reminder of what she had endured. Her hands raw, her ribs aching, but her fire untamed. She whispered to herself that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The recruits charged together a wave of bodies and fists and boots. Their determination sharpened by humiliation, they would not allow a mechanic to stand above them. They would not let her prove stronger than those who had trained in the art of war. The circle collapsed on her like the jaws of a beast snapping shut, the dust exploding upward as they struck, and the mechanic braced herself for the storm. Her arms rose instinctively, deflecting the first blow, her shoulder twisting as she ducked. Beneath another strike, pain searing through her ribs as a knee connected with her side. She staggered but did not fall, her foot sweeping outward to knock one opponent off balance. She spun with the momentum, driving her elbow into another chest, each movement drawn from memory and will. The drills she had studied in silence now living through her body like second nature. But the numbers pressed heavy against her. The rhythm of attacks, relentless fists hammered against her, guard kicks tore. At her legs, her breath came ragged, each gasp a battle on its own. Her muscles screamed for rest. Her knees threatened to buckle, yet her eyes never wavered, her mind refusing to surrender. She told herself she had stood against doubt all her life. She had been dismissed as nothing more than grease and steel. She would not let them take this moment from her. One attacker lunged from behind, locking his arm around her throat, his weight dragging her back while another charged head-on, fists raised. To crush her. She twisted hard, shifting her body into the choke, slamming her boot against the knee of the one holding her. The joint buckled and he collapsed, releasing her grip just enough for her to duck free as the other came forward. Her fist drove upward into his chin, snapping his head back with a crack that echoed through the compound. The circle reeled, but recovered quickly, their pride refusing to let them slow. They circled tighter, shouting as they pressed harder. The mechanic bent low, her lungs burning, her eyes stinging with sweat, her body beginning to falter. Yet her spirit surged stronger than ever. She thought of the SEALs who trained with fire in their veins. She thought of machines that roared back to life when no one believed they could. She thought of herself, the invisible one who had stood silent until the moment came to rise. Her stance shifted. Her breathing slowed, though pain racked her body. She forced control, each inhale steady, each exhale focused. The recruits rushed again, but this time she did not meet them head-on. She sidestepped, turning their speed against them, her hand catching one wrist, dragging him forward so his body slammed into another, her elbow striking into a third, who had rushed. Too close, she flowed like water, bending and twisting and striking where it hurt most. The instructors at the edge leaned forward, their expressions still hard, but their eyes alive with a flicker of something unspoken. They had seen recruits fight, with strength and skill, but rarely with the kind of raw defiance that turned pain into fuel. The mechanic was breaking the rhythm of the drill, bending it into her own shape, proving she could not only endure but dominate in the chaos. And yet they remained silent, refusing to end it, pushing her to see if she had limits. Her body faltered again, a strike slipping past her guard, slamming into her side, the air bursting from her lungs. She stumbled across the dirt, vision blurring, the circle roared. With triumph, sensing weakness, they surged together, their shadows blotting out the sun as they bore down on her. Her knees bent as if she might collapse, but in that moment, she remembered the engines she had saved at their last breath. She remembered how fire and grit could bring steel back to life, and she drew that same fire into herself. She roared with effort, driving upward, her fist snapping into the jaw of one opponent, her shoulder slamming into another, her knee crushing into the stomach. Of a third, the recruits collapsed around her, the dust rising in clouds, her body shaking, but her stance still unbroken, her chest heaving, her hands bloodied, her eyes sharp with a fire that refused to fade. She stood surrounded by groaning bodies, but she knew more were still standing, waiting for the next rush. The silence hung thick, only broken by the groans of the fallen and the ragged breathing of those still circling. The mechanic felt her body trembling close to collapse, yet she refused. To kneel, she had walked into the compound as a mechanic unseen and unvalued, but every moment here was forging her into something new, and as the remaining recruits prepared to strike again, she clenched her fists and told herself this was not the end. The sound of boots striking the ground grew louder, cutting through the haze of dust and groans. The recruits who had fallen scattered aside, their bodies bruised and broken, their eyes wide with disbelief, as the next group emerged from the shadows. They were not recruits. These were seasoned fighters, men and women who had already proven themselves in countless drills. Their bodies hardened, their eyes sharp and calculating. The instructors had unleashed the final test, the one designed to strip away the last ounce of strength and reveal whether the mechanic had the heart to endure. She staggered to her feet, her body trembling, her face streaked with blood and sweat, her lungs burning with each breath, her arms heavy, but she forced them into guard position, her eyes locking on the advancing figures. They did not move with the reckless energy of recruits. They moved with discipline, controlled steps, measured breaths, each one waiting for the smallest opening, each one ready to strike with precision and efficiency. The mechanic understood that this was no longer about endurance. This was about survival at a level she had never faced before. The first fighter lunged, his motion sharp and efficient, his fist slicing through the air. He slipped aside, but not fast enough, the edge of the strike catching her shoulder and sending a wave of pain down her arm. She grit her teeth, her vision flashing, but she spun with the momentum driving her knee into his side, the contact hard enough. To stagger him back, the others did not pause. They flowed forward, filling the gap. Their attacks layered one after another, a storm of fists and boots. She could barely deflect. Her breath tore through her throat, her ribs aching as she twisted away from a strike, only to feel another slam against her back, the force dropping her to one knee. The circle tightened, their movements fluid, their precision honed, and in that instant she felt the crushing weight of what she faced. She was only one body, one exhausted mechanic standing against fighters trained to dismantle opponents like machines. Still, she rose, swaying her fists, clenched, her eyes alive with fire, refusing to kneel to anyone. She remembered the nights in the hangar alone when the engines roared to life under her hands, machines that should have failed but did not, because she refused to let them. She told herself her body was the same, a broken machine that would keep fighting if she demanded it. She forced her stance firm, her fists rising as the fighters struck again. She countered with elbows, knees, and shoulders, her movements sharper than thought, her instincts driving her, even as her body begged her to collapse. The instructors stood at the edge, silent, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes locked on the spectacle in front of them. This was no longer just training. This was revelation. This was proof of whether the mechanic would be cast aside or acknowledged, and they watched as she moved like a shadow, her strikes efficient, her counters brutal. She did not fight like someone taught in a classroom. She fought like someone who had built her own knowledge from fragments forged in fire and sharpened by necessity. The fighters pressed harder, one swinging wide while another dove low. She spun between them, her boot catching one jaw, her elbow cracking against another skull. The circle faltered for only a heartbeat before closing again, their discipline refusing to break. She staggered, blood dripping into her eyes, her breath ragged, her heart pounding like a war drum. She knew she could not last forever, but she also knew she did not need forever. She only needed one more moment, one more chance to show she would not fall. The clash grew harsher. bodies colliding in brutal rhythm. The mechanic struck again and again, her knuckles raw, her muscles burning, the fighters groaning but refusing to quit. She twisted aside from a kick, her body rolling across the dirt, her hand catching the leg and, dragging her opponent down, she rose in the same motion, her boot slamming into another chest, sending him sprawling across the ground. The circle shifted their stance, tightening their formation, their voices low, their intent clear. They would not allow her another opening. Her legs trembled beneath her, her vision darkening at the edges, her hands shaking. But still she raised her fists, her eyes fierce and unbroken. The fighters circled slower now, testing her, reading her, waiting for the perfect strike to end it all. The silence in the compound, heavy enough to suffocate every recruit, every instructor, every fighter knew. The next exchange would decide everything, whether she belonged here or whether she would be crushed into the dirt forgotten. Leader of the fighters stepped forward, his body tall and broad, his eyes cold with focus, his fists clenched. He moved with the ease of someone who had broken countless opponents before his presence, alone enough to tighten her chest. The others stepped, back giving him the space to finish it. The mechanic steadied her breathing, her body swaying her ribs, screaming, her spirit unyielding. This was the moment she had carried in silence for years, the moment to prove whether she was only a mechanic or something far greater. He lunged his strike, a blur of force, his body crashing toward hers faster than her eyes could follow. She moved by instinct, her body dropping low, her fist rising sharp, her boot twisting into. The training compound stretched wide under the punishing sun, a place built to break down even the hardest recruits. Concrete walls and obstacle courses cut across the sand, and every corner held the weight of discipline and silence. But in the middle of it all stood a figure who did not belong, at least not in the eyes of the others. She was the mechanic, the one who turned wrenches and made engines sing, while the warriors trained with rifles and knives, and yet there she was staring back at them with eyes that dared them to underestimate her. They had heard the whispers before, that she had no business in the training yard, that the field was for fighters, not for those who spent their days knee-deep in grease and steel. But she had stepped into the arena without hesitation, and when the instructors called for volunteers to test strength against overwhelming numbers, she did not flinch, and the moment she raised her hand, the others closed in their grins, sharp with cruelty, their voices low with doubt, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of cornering prey. The circle formed fast boots scraping the dirt, their bodies shifting like predators ready to strike. And the mechanic stood at the center, her hands steady, her breathing controlled. Though her heart pounded with the rhythm of war drums, she remembered every moment she had watched the SEALs train, every tactic she had studied in silence, while pretending to look away, every detail she had memorized while turning bolts and checking fuel. She was never just a mechanic. She was a witness to disciplined precision and controlled violence, and now the moment had come to test if observation could become action. One recruit stepped forward, his shoulders broad, his smile mocking as he feinted left and struck right. A blow aimed to catch her off balance, but she shifted her weight with practiced instinct, her body bending low as the strike cut through empty air. Her elbow shot upward, slamming against his ribs, the sound sharp enough to silence the laughter around the circle. The man stumbled back, clutching his side. The grin gone from his face, replaced by disbelief as she straightened her stance, her eyes cutting toward the next challenger. The others hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Pride would not let them stand idle. They surged together, two at once, fists slicing through the air, but she moved with a flow that surprised even herself. One strike parried, one kick deflected her body, twisting like a machine finely tuned. And in the split second that followed, her knee drove into one chest, her hand hooking behind the other neck, dragging him down into the dirt. The circle erupted with shouts. the energy rising as the mechanic held her ground. Sweat poured down her back, but her mind was sharper than fire. She recalled the drills she had memorized, the countermeasures, the escape tactics she had practiced alone in the shadows of the hangar. She knew she could not outmuscle them, but she could outthink them. She could turn their force against them. She could show them that being underestimated was the deadliest weapon of all. And as the recruits regrouped, circling her tighter, the air thick with the promise of violence, she steadied her breathing and readied for the next wave. The instructors watched from the edge of the compound, their faces unreadable but their eyes locked on her. Every move they had seen recruits crumble under far less. They had seen men break when the numbers pressed in, but here was the mechanic holding fast, her stance shifting with each step, the circle closing like jaws, and still she did not falter. She had not yet revealed what she truly carried within her, and as the next attack came from 3 directions at once, she braced herself to unleash what she had kept hidden. Her muscles coiled like steel springs, her feet shifting across the dirt as the recruits charged their fists, raised their confidence, blinding them to the storm. Building in her eyes, she inhaled once, a sharp breath, steady and controlled, and then she struck her body, snapping into motion faster than their minds could catch. The mechanic moved not as an amateur, not as a bystander, but as someone who had absorbed the very essence of SEAL tactics. Every strike, every counter, every finish crafted with precision born of silent study. The dust rose around them, shouts echoing across the compound, bodies colliding in brutal rhythm, but when it cleared, she still stood at the center, her chest heaving, her arms steady, her eyes unbroken. The recruits sprawled around her, groaning in disbelief. The circle shattered by the force of her will. And yet she knew this was only the beginning. For though she had survived the first test, the instructors had not called a halt, and more footsteps pounded against the dirt, closing in on her position. The dust had barely settled when the next wave closed in, their boots pounding the ground in unison, their eyes sharp with anger and humiliation. The first circle of recruits lay groaning on the dirt, their pride shattered, but the instructors gave no command to stop, and that silence was more dangerous than any shout. It meant the trial was far from over. The mechanic stood with her chest heaving, her muscles burning, but her stance steady, her gaze locked on the new threat. They fanned out quickly, forming a wider ring than before, moving with more coordination. These were not raw recruits anymore. They were men and women who had fought through drills and combat simulations, who knew how to read an opponent and press weaknesses. They circled her like wolves, their movements disciplined, their strikes planned and still. She remained calm, her memory unspooling everything she had absorbed during long nights watching the SEALs train their drills, their breathing, their angles. She had studied it all in silence, and now every detail was rising to the surface. One charged from the front, while 2 flanked her from the sides, a tactic designed to split her focus, to overwhelm her with numbers, but she shifted her weight and drew them in her eyes, flicking from shoulder to hip. Reading the smallest tells, she spun low, hooking the leg of the one to her left, sending him tumbling across the dirt, while her elbow snapped back to strike the one on her right, her hand shooting forward to deflect the blow from the front, each movement a seamless chain born from memory and instinct. The circle erupted with shouts as the fallen rolled to his feet, fury. In his eyes, the others pressed harder now, their strikes faster, their attacks sharper. Sweat poured down her face, her body screaming under the strain, but still she moved with the relentless precision of someone who refused to break 1 step back. 2 steps forward, twist strike, counter pivot. The rhythm of combat becoming the only language she knew, her mind running faster than her body, yet her body refusing to quit. The instructors exchanged glances, their faces hard, but their eyes glinting. With something that looked like approval, they had seen many crumble under the weight of numbers. But here was the mechanic, moving with a clarity that defied her role. She was not just surviving. She was adapting. She was pulling from every shadowed lesson she had memorized and making it her own. The recruits grew desperate, their frustration boiling as each attempt to corner her dissolved into failure. But frustration could be dangerous, and they began to change their tactics. One feinted high. While another swept low, a third lunged from behind. She barely slipped clear the edge of a strike, grazing her ribs. The pain sharp enough to steal her breath. She staggered for the first time, her knees bending as the circle sensed weakness. The recruits surged in with renewed hunger, the air thick with tension, as if the desert itself waited to see if she would fall. Her vision blurred, her chest burning, but deep inside a flame roared. She thought of every day she had been dismissed, every word spoken. Behind her back, every laugh that said she did not belong. She thought of engines roaring to life under her hands, of machines that should have failed, but did not, because she refused to give up. She thought of the SEALs who fought with honor and skill and discipline, and she told herself she would not be the one to quit. She would not be the one to break. Her body snapped back into motion, raw willpower pushing her through pain. She rolled across the dirt, slipping beneath a strike her leg, lashing out to sweep one attacker down her hand, catching another, wrist twisting until the man cried out and dropped his weapon. She spun with the momentum, driving her shoulder into the chest of the third, sending him sprawling across the sand. The dust rising like smoke around her figure, unbroken in the center of chaos. The recruits hesitated again, panting, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes darting toward the instructors as if waiting for a signal to stop, but none came. The silence stretched, heavy, their pride clashing with exhaustion. The mechanic straightened her back, her arms trembling but her gaze steady. She dared them to come again. She dared them to test her resolve. She dared them to see if she could endure more than they thought possible. And slowly, with grim determination, they began to move once more. The circle tightened, the air pulsed with violence, and the mechanic felt her body on the edge, her strength waning. Her breath ragged, but her spirit unbroken. This was more than training now. This was the crucible that would decide if she belonged or if she would be cast aside. She clenched her fists, her heart thundering, her mind sharpening into razor focus, because she knew that the next exchange would not only test her skill, but reveal whether she had the heart of a warrior or not.